Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to be discussing poetry, which is perfect because April is National Poetry Month, so we get to start off our month with a lecture with speaking about poetry. So poetry can be difficult. Children tend to really like rhymes from a young age, nursery rhymes, chants, music lyrics. But if asked, most children and most of us might say they don't like poetry. What they probably don't like is studying poetry because it can be difficult, I think, to understand poetry. And it's important to do that. But I think that we can get our students to like poetry and to remind them of the joy of poetry by sharing wonderful poetry with them, particularly during this month, but all through the year also. There's so many amazing books of poetry in many different formats. Even if along with what we think of as poetry books, or collections of poetry or individual poems, picture books are often in rhyme, and they're often just illustrated poems. Nonfiction can be done in poetry form, and I'll show you that in the lecture. And also novels in verse have always been around, but they become more popular at certain times, and there's some authors out there writing some wonderful novels in verse. This is one kind of poetry book, probably what you kind of think of when you think of a book of poetry. It's poems by one author collected together in a book. This can be thick or thin. Shel Silverstein is a classic and a favorite. Often it is the one book that students will tell me they remember from when they were children, or that is their favorite collection of poems, or he's their favorite poet. So, but this is one way that you'll see poetry where it's organized around sometimes a theme by the same author, or sometimes just a collection of poems all by the same author. This particular book organizes the poetry around a subject. In this case, the title is Song of the Water Boatman and Other Pond Poems, so it's all about ponds, animals and other flora and fauna in ponds. And I like this book. It's nonfiction. You get the poem, and then you get a little blurb of the nonfiction, and it's beautiful illustrations. So here we go. Here's the poem on the left-hand side of the two-page spread, and this is about spring peepers. And then on the right-hand side, we get a small blurb about the spring peepers, a little more information. So it's a nice combination of poetry, enjoying poetry, and learning facts about particular, it's both animals and other flora and fauna in ponds. This is another kind of book, poetry, or reading aloud poetry. All poetry is great for reading aloud. This one gives you a chance to put four students together so that they're not feeling singled out because they're up there reading a poem themselves. You read together, and it's kind of a fun book. Each of these lines is a line of the poem, and sometimes all four people are speaking together, sometimes two or one speak, but you could have four students standing around the book and reading together, and it would be a fun experience and less intimidating, I think, than having one student stand up and read poetry. This is a novel in verse, Love That Dog by Sharon Creech. It's from the point of view of Jack, who does not want to write poetry for his class. And it's for ages 8 to 12, and it starts off very simply telling Jack's story as he sits in room 105 in Miss Stretchberry's class on September 13. I don't want to because boys don't write poetry, girls do. And you can see he tried, I tried, can't do it, brain's empty. We all know that feeling. And it goes on to chronicle his experiences trying to write a poem in this class. This is, again, a collection of poems by one author, Paul Janesco. But it's an example. Oh, I wanted to show you this because it's very useful, this pronunciation guide. If you don't know how to say a person's name, this tells you.
Hello, my name is Paul Janesco. It's a Polish name, so in the old country it would be pronounced Janeczko, but it is Janesco in America, and the way to remember it is that the CZ is really an S, so Janesco.
This is really useful. I've gone to this several times when I just don't know how to say their name, and it's under teachingbooks.net, so the person themselves tells you how they pronounce their names, and you just look up the name. And there's also some links there too, but I thought I'd show that to you as part of this. But these are concrete poems, and concrete poems are arranged to look like the subject of the poem. And actually, this is not by one person. I misspoke. This is edited by Janesco. So he collected poems by different authors. So we had Shel Silverstein, who was one poet and collected all their poems. This one is edited volume collected by Janesco. So this poem is called Balloon, and you can see as big as ball, as round as sun, I tug and pull you when you run, and when the wind blows, I say politely, hold me tightly. So you can see the poem is shaped like the balloon that it's describing in the poem. So concrete poems can be a lot of fun. Having your students write concrete poems is a great way to explore poetry. So there's several books of concrete poem. I think there's one called Lemonade that's good. And you can find other examples of concrete poetry. This one's nice because the illustrations are by Chris Rashka. This one's a really different kind of poetry book. I think this is kind of unique, and it's called Reverse Poetry. This says grades 1 to 4 is suggested. I think can be used with much older students, especially if you wanted them to do something similar. And this is by Marilyn Singer. And basically, the book, each poem is read forward and backwards, and together they tell a story. So you start with this one, read my book, and then just imagine this: me in my garret, working all alone. How hard it was to write. I need to tell the world the truth. So here goes. I beg your pardon, fairies helped. And so then we start with the end. Fairies helped. I beg your pardon. So here goes the truth. I need to tell the world how hard it was to write. Me in my garret, working all alone. Just imagine this, and then read my book. So this particular volume has fairy and folktale themes. She's come out with 2 additional ones. I think there's one out, a new one, 2017. And I don't know that I love them, but it's kind of interesting and kind of a challenge. If you can see, the only thing that's changed between the 2 is the punctuation, which gives it a different, they're flipped and then punctuation. So she's called them reverso poems. Nonfiction. This is another example of, I believe it's nonfiction. It's the story of Emmett Till. A powerful book about the lynching of a teenage boy in 1955 in Mississippi. It's written in a very formal style, sonnets in which the last line of one poem is the first line of the next. But I really think the formality gives great power to the retelling. It was a Prince Honor book, grades 9 to 12. So this is because of the subject matter and the formality of the poetry, and there's a lot of text. This is for a little older. Another novel in verse, Karen Hess, Out of the Dust, story of 14-year-old Billy Joe's difficult life during the Oklahoma Dust Bowl. You compare this, I think I mentioned this, another one, pair this with Ken Burns' wonderful documentary on the Dust Bowl. and middle school. Some places list it for younger, but it really is a tough story. I think fifth grade might be the youngest for this, depending on the students that that you have for this, the students in your class. Kwame Alexander has been doing some great books. This is Crossover, which is about two junior high school boys, Josh and Justin, I forget, and it's amazing poetry. Some of it looks a little bit like concrete poetry, and basketball, loving family, and it's told in verse. So you see here where the words are moving around. He's talking about dribbling and during basketball, and you can see that there's a lot of movement in the layout of the poem. Here there's less movement. So it's Josh and I forget what the other one is. So it's beautiful, beautiful writing, amazing writing. He's got other books out now, but he has, you can see he got a Coretta Scott King for this and a Newbery, and great for anyone who loves basketball, boy or girl, but you might also find that it appeals to, why won't that go away? It appeals to boys particularly because it's got the sports in it. You don't always find a good combination of sports and poems, so it's good. This is another book, Poems in the Attic by Nikki Grimes. And in this book, this book appealed to me because the main character, her parents, or one parent is in the Navy or Army, I forget, where they move all over the place, and so she's staying with grandma, and she finds a box of poems that her mother had written that her grandmother had saved, and it's just like I said, it struck a note with me because I moved all over with my dad in the Navy, and so this one kind of appealed to me. This is kind of a fun way to have your students create poetry or to display poetry. It's called book spine poetry. So you just put together titles that make a poem. In the spring, split splat, rain romp, raindrop plop. Who likes rain? Actually, today I don't, because it was cold and rainy today. But it's kind of a fun thing to think about doing with poetry. Other children's poets that there's a lot of them, but Jack Prelutsky has been very popular. Douglas Florian does some interesting ones. Lee Bennett Hopkins. Arnold Adolph has been around for a long time. Langston Hughes is an old one. They've turned some of his, I mean, he's not an old one. He's from early on, the 30s, I think he was writing, but they still continue to turn his poems into books and collections of his poems. Nikki Grimes, we just had, Kwame Alexander. So some of the articles I have given you to read have additional suggestions for poets, but I just wanted to give you some other names in addition to the couple that I've introduced you to in the lecture. Okay, some poetry resources, and I'm going to post these slides so that you have these links. This was in SLJ, School Library Journal. They took NCTE does this every year, Excellence in Poetry for Children, and this one got nicely illustrated and put together in a fun and colorful annotated bibliography with some suggestions. There's Poems in the Attic. So here's Lee Bennett Hopkins, Amazing Places. And so this is one place to find some poetry. Oh, this one's good, Flutter and Hum, Animal Poems. It's bilingual, English and Spanish. So that's one way. They also have lists of them that are annotated but not as notably. The NCTE does a award for a poet. Here's Marilyn Nelson, who did where is it? She did the Emmett Till one. And so the last couple we had Marilyn Singer, Joyce Sidman, who did the songs. Oh, J. Patrick Luce is also good. But they have the other previous notable poetry books, not as nicely illustrated, but you get a list of books to check out. Poetry for Kids, Walt Whitman, huh, that's interesting. And then they have 2017 notable verse novels. Here's Booked, that's the other one, the newest one by Kwame Alexander, 2016. And if you noticed, he had one from the poetry books in this one here, Animal Ark. I haven't read that one. It's with National Geographic. I don't know if that's nonfiction or fiction. This one's probably nonfiction. Cricket in the Thicket, poems about bugs, could be. Oh, he's supposed to be very good. Francisco Alarcon, family poems for every day of the week. So that's a good resource. And why did I go back here? Daily Poetry is a fun site if you want to include poems. If you want to get a new poem every day, it takes about a minute. You can use this in your class, or you can use the menu to look up different poems by date, by title. Let's see, poems by date. How do they do this? Oh, September. So if you're looking for poems to read this month, Joy in Mudville. So here's the poem. They said it takes about a minute to read the poem. It tells you the book it's from and about the poem, about the author. So and if you like that book, where to get it. So this is an example. Oh, this is just an excerpt, but this looks like the book was written. The picture book was written as a poem and then illustrated. Poetry 180 is another one. Oh, come on. Sorry. For some reason, I'm having difficulty getting to Poetry 180. Okay, gives you a poem for 180 days, each day of the school year. If you manage to with snow days, get 180 days in. So you can start from the beginning, Introduction to Poetry, and then the last poem is called Break. But you can also just kind of use this as a source of poetry, poems. So I'm just going to look at this one, The Distances, and it tells you where it came from, all rights reserved, and it was reprinted by permission from these people. Let me just see. Copyright reprinted. So if you're interested in more poems by that person, you have the information there. Poets.org is another good resource. It has different poems. It has, this was, if you go down here, you can see that AASL gave it a best websites for teaching and learning. And here's lesson plans for introducing poetry, information about different poets, a poet's glossary. So it's a really useful resource. Here again, Poem a Day. So Poem a Day is original and only daily digital 200 new previously unpublished poems. So as opposed to the other ones where it's from different books, although this one, it says originally originally published in Poem a Day on April 4th, 2018. So it's a new poem just from this. Although it's about Fannie Lou Hamer, that's interesting. So that's good. Poetry slams are an interesting thing that you could use in your classroom, and you can use them in any kind of, with any grade. I usually associate poetry slams with olders. It's basically a competition with original work, and it's judged. This one is a cute example of poetry slams.
Welcome to Poetry Stage.
Grade 2 poetry slam.
What do you want to have or see or do? I want to risk to travel and make a difference. I just want to pack up my guitar and go. Everyone wants to make a difference sometimes. That's my dream.
I want to be a heavy metal performer. I want to go to the Lorax. I love to dance to hip hop. I always say, yo, what's up?
Give it up for Mara.
And I love the
Mara,
encouragement
yeah, I couldn't.
given
There's a
to
kid,
these
you don't
each
have to.
student, so you can have an elementary poetry slam. If you want some more information about poetry slams, this is part of Brave New Voices, that website, and it talks about teen poetry slams. There's actually competitions in the Bay, but there's a nice poetry, a slam guidebook, which is nice because you could use this to talk about what is a poetry slam, and then rules and guidelines, tips and advice. So there's Poetry Slam is a competition in which poets share their work in front of an audience and are scored on a scale of 1 to 10 by a panel of judges from an array of backgrounds. It's to defy mediums and platforms and create an interactive experience for both the poets and the audience. So it's a great way for students to share, oops, don't want to go back there, to share their poetry and to get involved. You could do it in a library, you could do it as part of your class, and it could be, you know, something that is an extracurricular, so it's really cool. And I thought this was very cool. It talks about American Sign Language poetry. It's called Def Jam, and this to me is fascinating because if you look at this where it says what is ASL? It's a three-dimensional art form where body movements can mean. So there's no paper or text. It's not written down. It's created in sign language, and you can't write down the body. You know, sign language is so much more expressive and involves more of the body than just your hands. So this can't be written down, but it's just so cool. I think this is a great way to include. So if you're having a poetry slam, you can welcome in your students who might use sign language or no sign language and want to express themselves differently. If you're feeling frustrated because of current things, listen to Taylor Mali, because he was a teacher, and this one's called I'll Fight You for the Library, and this is slam poetry, which is less in a poetic form. This one's actually poetry.
I'll Fight You for the Library. For Dr. Joseph D'Angelo, my 5th and 6th grade English teacher, PhD, 8th degree black belt, sensei. Hooah. I'll Fight You for the Library, a poem in 4 letters. 1. To Clarissa Lerner, librarian. Dear Clarissa, I understand that the research periods I reserved in the library next week for my classes have been canceled. Just out of curiosity, who and or what is more important than my class's research needs? 2. To Nancy Devlin, Secretary to Dr. Richard Blackstone, Dean of Instruction. Dear Nancy, the librarian informs me that Dr. Blackstone has reserved the library for a facilities utilization meeting of the administration next week, and that all classes scheduled to meet in the library on that day must meet elsewhere. This is unconscionable. Academic instruction takes precedence over administrative meetings, period. That Dr. Blackstone, the Dean of Instruction, would even consider canceling one class's library period in order to hold a meeting called facilities utilization is so obtuse, I am incapable of appreciating the irony in it.
So if you want to hear the rest of that, you can go click on that, but I always find that quite amusing. And he's got some other good ones about teaching. And this one I thought was very cool. You can combine your 3D printer with poetry and have your students print a spiral poem bracelet. And so you can have them write a short poem, and then if you have access to a printer, and this is lovely that they have this particular octopus here on the front page, and I can figure out how to get used to it, get rid of it. But it's kind of a fun way to combine STEM and to do your STEAM, art and engineering at the same time. So just, I thought that was a fun thing to share. So that's the poetry resources and our poetry lecture. And like I said, I will be adding this to, I'll be updating this with all the links and the books, and hopefully you'll find some good poetry books to read this week. And I will see you on the discussion board. Thank you.